Thomas was awake, standing at the edge of the clearing, staring into the thick line of trees. His face was tense, his jaw clenched, and I could tell he was thinking the same thing I was about what awaited us in the graveyard. I approached him, my footsteps quiet on the soft ground. He didn't turn around, but I knew he sensed me. "You're sure about this?" I asked, my voice low. He nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving the trees. "I'm sure. It's the only way. We can't keep hiding forever." I swallowed hard, my stomach twisting with unease. I knew he was right. The sanctuary might protect us from the collectors, but it wasn't a permanent solution. The graveyard was where everything had started, and if we were lucky, it would be where we found the answers we needed to end it. "We'll have to be careful," I said, trying to steady my voice. "If the collectors are waiting for us, we can't just walk in there blind." Thomas finally turned to me, his expression grim but determined. "We won't be blind. We know what they want, and we know where to start." I nodded, though I wasn't sure how much that knowledge would help us. The collectors were powerful, forces of nature, as the man had called them, and the dead weren't exactly on our side either. We were walking into a trap, and we both knew it. But we didn't have a choice. The others in the sanctuary were still waking up when Thomas and I packed what little we had. A few of them watched us, their expressions a mix of curiosity and fear. No one tried to stop us, though. No one asked to come with us. They had made their choice, to hide, to wait. But I couldn't do that anymore. As we prepared to leave, the man who had led us to the sanctuary approached, his dark eyes fixed on Thomas and me. "You understand the risks," he said, his voice steady. "Once you enter the graveyard, you may not come out, not alive." I nodded, though my heart pounded in my chest. "We know." The man studied us for a long moment, as if weighing our resolve. Then, slowly, he reached into the folds of his coat and pulled out a small, worn book. Its cover was faded, the pages yellowed with age, but there was something about it, something powerful. "This might help," he said, handing the book to Thomas. "It's an old text about the boundaries between life and death. There are rituals inside, ways to protect yourself from the dead and from those who hunt them." Thomas took the book, his fingers brushing the worn cover. He nodded gratefully, though his face remained grim. "Thank you." The man nodded once, then stepped back, his dark eyes lingering on me for a moment longer. "Be careful, Samuel," he said softly. "The dead remember you. They always will." A chill ran down my spine, but I nodded, unable to find the words to respond. He was right, of course. The dead had been my family once, but now I wasn't sure if they were my protectors or my captors. Either way, I couldn't ignore them anymore. We left the sanctuary and returned to the forest with the book in hand. The trees seemed even taller now, their twisted branches reaching toward the sky like the hands of forgotten spirits. The air was thick and heavy with the scent of earth and decay, and every step we took seemed to echo in the silence. Thomas led the way, his eyes fixed on the path ahead. I followed closely behind, my heart racing with every step. The further we went, the more the weight of the journey pressed down on me. We were walking into the unknown, a place that had once been home but was now filled with danger. But as we neared the forest's edge, the faint outline of the graveyard walls appeared in the distance. The iron gate stood tall and foreboding, its bars blackened with age, and beyond it, the familiar shapes of the tombstones loomed like silent sentinels. For a moment, I hesitated. The last time I had been here, I had barely escaped. The shadows, the voices, the woman who had pretended to be my mother were all waiting for me, and now I was walking right back into their grasp. Thomas stopped at the edge of the tree line, his eyes scanning the graveyard. "We'll go in at dusk," he said quietly. "It'll give us cover. The collectors are most active at night, but won't expect us this soon." I nodded, though my nerves were already frayed. I wasn't sure if there was any time we could enter the graveyard that would make me feel safe. We waited for the sun to set, hiding in the shadows of the trees. The air grew colder as the day faded into night. The sky turned a deep, bruised purple, and the stars began to flicker faintly overhead. I watched the graveyard, my heart pounding in my chest, my mind racing with memories of the spirits who had raised me. And then, as the sun's last light disappeared behind the horizon, we moved. Thomas and I slipped through the iron gate, our footsteps silent on the overgrown path. The graveyard was just as I remembered it, quiet, still, and filled with the weight of the dead. The tombstones, cracked and weathered by time, stood like silent witnesses to the lives that had been lived and lost here. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, and the fog that clung to the ground swirled around our feet like the whispers of forgotten souls. We moved quickly, making our way toward the center of the graveyard. The book the man had given us was tucked under Thomas's arm, and I could see the tension in his shoulders, the weight of what we were about to face pressing down on him. "We'll start at the oldest graves," Thomas whispered as we walked. "That's where the connection between life and death is strongest. If the collectors are going to be anywhere, it'll be there." I nodded, my eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. The dead were here. I could feel them. The whispers were faint, just a soft hum at the edges of my consciousness. But they were there, watching, waiting. As we reached the center of the graveyard, the fog thickened, swirling around us in dense clouds. The tombstones here were ancient, their inscriptions worn away by time, and the trees that lined the path were twisted and gnarled, their branches hanging low like the arms of the dead reaching out to claim us. Thomas stopped before one of the oldest graves, eyes scanning the ground. "This is it," he said quietly. "This is where we'll start." I knelt beside him, my heart racing as I watched him open the book. The pages were filled with strange symbols and rituals, instructions for dealing with the dead and protecting oneself from the forces between life and death. "Are you sure this will work?" I asked, my voice trembling. Thomas didn't answer right away. He flipped through the pages, his brow furrowed in concentration. "It has to," he said finally. "It's all we've got." He began to read the words aloud, his voice steady but low, the strange language flowing from his lips like a chant. As he spoke, the air around us seemed to thicken, the fog swirling faster, the shadows growing darker, and then the ground beneath us began to tremble. I staggered back, my heart pounding as the earth shifted, the tombstones shaking, the fog swirling in violent eddies around us. The whispers of the dead grew louder, more insistent, their voices a chorus of anger and fear. "Samuel," they whispered, their voices echoing through the graveyard. "Samuel." I looked around, my breath coming in short gasps. The spirits were close now, their presence pressing on me from all sides. I could feel them, watching, waiting. And then, out of my eye, I saw movement. The shadows were shifting, pulling together, forming something terrible. A figure emerged from the fog, its form dark and twisted, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. It was impossibly tall, its limbs long and thin, like the branches surrounding us. And its face was nothing but a mask of darkness, featureless and terrible. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. "The collector," Thomas whispered, his voice tight with fear. The figure moved slowly and deliberately toward us, the fog swirling around it like a cloak. I could feel its presence, its power, pressing down on me, suffocating me. The whispers of the dead grew louder, their voices a cacophony of fear and anger. "Samuel," they whispered again. "Come back." I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The collector was coming for me. The collector stood before us, towering and unnatural, its shadowy form seeming to pull in the darkness around it. The fog clung to its body, swirling like smoke, and its glowing eyes bored into me, hollow and endless, as though it could see right through my soul. The weight of its presence pressed down on me, freezing me in place. My legs felt like they were made of stone, my chest tight with terror. "Samuel." The whispers came again, louder now, more insistent. "Come back." I couldn't move. The voices of the dead echoed through the graveyard, wrapping around me like a blanket of ice. I had been running from them for so long, trying to escape their pull, but now they were here, stronger than ever, calling me back. And standing between me and freedom was this thing, the collector. Thomas was still chanting from the book, his voice low and hurried, but I could see the fear in his eyes and how his hands trembled as he turned the pages. Whatever protection he was trying to invoke wasn't fast enough. The collector stepped forward, its body shifting with a strange, liquid grace. The air around us grew colder, and the fog thickened until it was hard to see more than a few feet in front of us. I could feel the dead closing in, their whispers growing louder and more desperate. "Samuel," they called. "You belong with us." My heart pounded in my chest, my breaths coming in ragged gasps. I had to move. I had to do something. But I couldn't tear my eyes away from the collector. It was like looking into the void, something ancient and terrible that existed beyond life and death. Suddenly, Thomas's voice faltered, his chant breaking off mid-sentence. The book slipped from his hands, falling to the ground with a soft thud. "Thomas?" I whispered, my voice trembling. He didn't answer. His eyes were wide, his face pale as he stared at the collector. I could see the fear etched into every line of his face, the same fear that gripped my heart and held me in place. But then, slowly, he turned to me, his expression hardening with determination. "We need to go," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Now!" "But," I began, my voice shaking. "Now!" he snapped, grabbing my arm and pulling me back. I stumbled, my legs stiff and uncooperative, but I forced myself to move, following Thomas as he dragged me away from the center of the graveyard. The fog swirled around us, the tombstones looming like silent sentinels as we ran. My heart pounded, my mind racing with fear and confusion. Behind us, the collector's footsteps echoed, slow and deliberate, like a clock ticking, counting down to something inevitable. "What do we do?" I gasped, my breath coming in short bursts as we ran. Thomas didn't answer right away, his face grim and focused as he led us through the winding paths of the graveyard. Finally, he spoke, his voice tight with fear. "We need to get to the gate. It's the only way out." The gate, the same iron gate I had escaped through once before. It felt like a lifetime ago, but I knew it was our only chance. If we could make it to the gate, we might be able to escape the collector and outrun the dead. But the fog was thick, the graveyard twisting around us like a maze. I could barely see the path ahead, and every time I glanced over my shoulder, the collector was there, always just behind us, moving with that same slow, deliberate pace. The whispers of the dead grew louder, swirling around me like a storm. Their voices were frantic now, pleading, begging me to come back, to stop running. They weren't just calling my name anymore. They were screaming it. "Samuel, come back!" I stumbled again, my foot catching on the edge of a broken tombstone. Thomas pulled me up, his grip tight on my arm, his eyes wild with fear. "Keep moving," he shouted, his voice barely audible over the roar of the whispers. I nodded, pushing myself forward, my legs burning with the effort. The gate couldn't be far now. We had to be close. But the fog was so thick, and the graveyard seemed to stretch forever, the tombstones shifting and changing around us like something alive. The collector was closer now. I could feel its presence heavy and oppressive, the air around us growing colder with every step. The weight of it prickled my skin like frost settling on my bones. I didn't dare look back. And then, through the fog, I saw it, the gate. It loomed ahead of us, tall and black, its iron bars gleaming faintly in the pale moonlight. Relief flooded through me, my heart pounding with the realization that we were almost there. Almost free. "We're close!" I shouted to Thomas, my voice shaking with fear and hope. He nodded, his face set with determination as we sprinted toward the gate. The fog swirled around us, but I could see the way out now, the path clear in my mind. If we could just reach the gate, if we could just get through. But then, just as we reached the edge of the clearing, something slammed into me from behind. I was thrown to the ground. My breath knocked from my lungs as the weight of the impact pinned me to the earth. The cold seeped into my skin, freezing my blood, and I felt the darkness close in around me, pressing down on me with an unbearable force. The collector. I gasped for breath, my hands scrabbling at the dirt as I tried to push myself up, but it was useless. The collector's weight was crushing, its presence suffocating, and I could feel its icy fingers wrapping around my throat, like squeezing the life from me. "Samuel," the voices whispered, soft and mocking now. "You can't run. You belong with us." I tried to scream, tried to fight, but the darkness was overwhelming, swallowing me whole. The world around me faded, the graveyard disappearing into a blur of shadows and fog. And then, through the haze, I heard Thomas's voice. "Samuel." I blinked, my vision swimming as I struggled to focus. Thomas stood over me, his face pale and desperate, the book in his hands again. He was chanting, his voice strong and clear, the words echoing like a lifeline. The collector hissed, its grip loosening for just a moment, and in that brief window of time, Thomas grabbed my arm, yanking me to my feet. "Run!" he shouted. I didn't need to be told twice. We bolted for the gate, the fog swirling around us, the air thick with the whispers of the dead. My lungs burned, my legs screaming with every step, but I kept moving, kept pushing forward. The gate was just ahead, the iron bars looming like salvation. I could see it now, the way out, freedom. But as we reached the gate, the collector let out a terrible, inhuman wail. The sound tore through the air, shaking the ground beneath our feet, and I could feel the dead rising, their presence closing in on us from all sides. Thomas reached the gate first, his hands grasping the cold iron as he pulled it open with all his strength. "Go!" he shouted, his voice hoarse with effort. I stumbled through the gate, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I collapsed onto the ground just outside the graveyard. The cold air hit my skin like a shock, and for a moment I just lay there, gasping for breath, my body trembling with exhaustion and fear. Thomas was beside me, his face pale but determined as he slammed the gate shut behind us. The collector's wail echoed through the night, but it couldn't follow us. Not here. We had made it. We were free. But as I lay there, staring at the sky, the realization hit me with a sickening weight. We weren't free. Not really. The dead were still out there. The collectors were still hunting us. And the graveyard, it would always be a part of me, a part of us. Thomas knelt beside me, his breath coming in short, ragged bursts. "We need to keep moving," he said quietly, his voice tight with fear. "They'll find us again." I nodded, though the exhaustion weighed down on me like a lead blanket. I wanted to rest, to stop running, but I knew he was right. The collectors would come for us again, and next time we might not be so lucky. Together, we stood and began to walk, leaving the graveyard behind. But as we disappeared into the night, the whispers of the dead lingered in my mind, soft and insistent. "You belong with us." The night stretched endlessly before us as we walked, the graveyard far behind, but never fully out of reach. Each step felt heavier than the last, the weight of what we had faced pressing down on me. The cold air bit at my skin, but it was the whispers of the dead that chilled me most, still echoing faintly in the back of my mind. I glanced at Thomas. His face was drawn, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion, but his gaze was fixed ahead, determined. I didn't know how he kept going. Even now, the terror of the graveyard still gripped me, but Thomas seemed to push it aside, driven by something deeper, something stronger. "We can't keep running like this," I said after a long silence, my voice barely louder than the wind. "They'll find us again." Thomas didn't look at me, his jaw set. "I know," he said quietly, "but we'll find a way. We have to." I nodded, though doubt gnawed at me. The dead would always follow me. The collector had nearly caught us, and I knew there were more like it, and no matter how far we ran, the whispers would never leave. The dead had marked me. I wasn't sure if anyone was escaping that. We walked silently, the dark road stretching endlessly before us. The moon hung low in the sky, casting long, eerie shadows across the ground. Every rustle of leaves or twigs snap sent a jolt of fear through me, my heart racing with the constant fear that something was following us, something from the graveyard. Finally, after hours, we came across an old, rundown house at the edge of a field. Its windows were dark, and the wood rotted and weathered by time. It looked abandoned, forgotten by the world, but it was shelter, at least for the night. "We should rest," Thomas said, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. "We'll need our strength." I nodded, too tired to argue. My body ached, and every part of me felt like it was on the verge of collapsing. We made our way to the house, its front door creaking loudly as Thomas pushed it open. The air inside was stale, thick with dust, and the floorboards groaned under our weight as we stepped inside. It wasn't much, but it was safe for now. Thomas sat heavily in the corner of the room, leaning back against the wall, his eyes half closed. I could see how exhausted he was, the weight of everything we had been through etched into his features. He had been strong for so long, but couldn't hold up forever. I sat down beside him, the silence between us heavy but not uncomfortable. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, but inside it was calm. For the first time in what felt like forever, I let myself relax, if only a little. "We'll figure this out," Thomas said after a long silence, his voice barely above a whisper. "There has to be a way to stop them." I didn't say anything. I wanted to believe him, but the weight of everything, the dead, the collectors, the shadows that seemed to follow us everywhere, was too much. I wasn't sure there was a way out, not for me. "You can't give up," Thomas said, turning to me. His eyes were filled with a fierce determination, even through the exhaustion. "We didn't come this far just to let them win." I met his gaze, and for a moment, my doubt wavered. Thomas had always had the plan. Who knew what to do when I didn't? If he believed we could find a way, maybe we could. "I'm not giving up," I said, though my voice was quieter than intended. "I'm just tired." Thomas gave me a small, understanding nod. "I know, but we can't stop now. They want something from us, and we must keep moving until we know what that is. We have to find the answers." The answers. That was the part that scared me the most. The dead had marked me, had claimed me in ways I didn't fully understand. The collectors were hunting us because of that. And whatever they wanted from me, I wasn't sure I wanted to know. But Thomas was right. We couldn't stop. Not now. We spent the night in that old house, the wind outside our only companion. I drifted in and out of sleep, haunted by nightmares of the graveyard, of the collector's cold, shadowy hands reaching for me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the dead, their pale faces staring at me from the darkness, their whispers filling my ears. By the time morning came, I felt more exhausted than ever. But we couldn't stay. We had to keep moving. As we left the house, the sun was low in the sky, its pale light casting long shadows across the field. The air was crisp and cold, a reminder that winter was creeping closer. But it wasn't the cold that made me shiver. It was the feeling that we were being watched. Thomas seemed to sense it too. He was tense, his eyes scanning the horizon as we walked. Every sound and movement made him flinch, and his hand tightened around the book he still carried. "What do we do now?" I asked, breaking the silence that had settled between us. Thomas didn't answer right away. His eyes were focused on something in the distance, and his brow furrowed in thought. Finally, he spoke, his voice quiet. "We need to learn more about the collectors and why they want us." I frowned, the weight of his words settling over me. "How do we do that?" "Someone might know," Thomas said, his voice low. "Someone who's been dealing with the dead for a long time. They call him the Keeper." The Keeper. The name sent a shiver down my spine. I didn't like the sound of it, but I knew that if we were going to get any answers, we had to follow every lead we could find. "Where is he?" I asked, my voice tight with unease. "He lives on the outskirts of the city," Thomas said. "He's reclusive, but if anyone knows how to deal with the collectors, it's him." The city. The idea of going back into the world of the living, especially so soon after our escape from the graveyard, made my stomach churn. But we didn't have a choice. If the Keeper could help us, we had to find him. The journey to the city was long and silent. The landscape around us shifted from fields and forests to the outskirts of civilization, where broken-down cars and crumbling buildings lined the streets like forgotten monuments to a world that had moved on. The sky above was a dull, overcast gray, casting everything in a cold, lifeless light. As we walked, the sense of being watched never left. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see the collector's shadowy figure lurking in the distance. But there was nothing, just the empty streets and the low hum of the wind. When we reached the city's outskirts, the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. The buildings here were old and abandoned, their windows shattered, their walls covered in faded graffiti. It was a place that had been forgotten by time, much like the graveyard itself. Thomas led the way, his steps purposeful but cautious. I followed close behind, my eyes scanning every alley and doorway, half expecting something to jump out at us. The weight of the dead still pressed down on me. Their whispers were faint but persistent, always there, reminding me they were watching. Finally, after hours, we reached a small, run-down building at the city's edge. Its windows were boarded up, and the door barely hung on its hinges. It didn't look like anyone had lived there in years, but Thomas seemed sure. "This is it," he said, his voice low. I stared at the building, my stomach twisting with unease. "Are you sure?" Thomas nodded. "He's here." We approached the door, and Thomas knocked, echoing through the empty street. For a long moment, there was no response, just the cold wind and the distant sounds of the city. Then, slowly, the door creaked open. A man stood in the doorway, his face gaunt and pale, his eyes sunken and shadowed. He looked older than anyone I had ever seen, but something ageless about him made my skin crawl. "You're looking for the keeper," the man said, his voice a low rasp. Thomas nodded, his expression serious. "We need his help." The man's eyes flicked to me, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. He studied me briefly, his gaze sharp and unsettling, before stepping aside to let us in. "This way," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. We stepped into the house, the air inside thick and musty, like it hadn't been touched in years. The walls were lined with shelves, each filled with strange old objects, books, trinkets, things that looked like they belonged in a museum. The light was dim. The only source was a few flickering candles scattered around the room. The man led us to a small table in the center of the room where he motioned for us to sit. Thomas and I exchanged a glance before taking our seats. The man sat across from us, his bony hands resting on the table, his eyes still fixed on me. "The keeper knows you're here," he said softly. "He's been expecting you." A chill ran through me. I didn't like how he said that. We were already part of some plan we didn't understand. Thomas leaned forward, his voice steady. "We need to know how to stop the collectors." The man's lips curled into a thin smile. "The collectors cannot be stopped. They are older than time and bound to life and death laws. But," he paused, his eyes flicking to me once more, "there may be another way." I swallowed hard, my heart pounding in my chest. "What do you mean?" "The collectors are drawn to those who have crossed the line between life and death," the man said slowly. "But they are bound by rules. There is a way to sever their connection to you, but it comes at a cost." "What cost?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The man leaned forward, his eyes dark and unreadable. "To sever the connection, you must return something taken from the dead, a life for a life." My stomach dropped. I didn't understand what he meant, but knew it wasn't good. The dead had raised me. I had been their child. What had I taken from them? "You are their child," the man said, as if reading my thoughts. "And to free yourself from their grasp, you must return to them, willingly." My heart raced. Return to the dead? Go back to the graveyard? Was that what he meant? "No," I said, shaking my head. "There has to be another way." The man smiled, though there was no warmth in it. "There is no other way." I looked at Thomas, my chest tight with fear. He met my gaze, his expression hard, determined, but I could see the fear in his eyes too. "We'll find another way," he said, standing abruptly. "Come on, Samuel." But as we turned to leave, the man's voice stopped us. "You can't run forever," he said softly. "The dead will always follow you. The collectors will always hunt you. This is the only way to end it." I froze, the weight of his words pressing down on me. I knew he was right. I couldn't keep running. I couldn't keep hiding. The dead will always be a part of me. But I wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. The man's words lingered like a dark cloud as Thomas and I exited the house and back into the cold, empty streets. The sky had darkened, and the low hum of the city in the distance felt strangely out of place after what we had just learned. I couldn't shake the feeling that everything had shifted. We were standing on the edge of something terrible. "He's wrong," Thomas said, breaking the silence. His voice was tense, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "There has to be another way." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe we could outrun the collectors to escape the dead without paying their price. But the man's words haunted me. A life for a life. I was the life that had been taken from the dead, and to break the connection, I had to give myself back to them. "Thomas," I said quietly, my voice heavy with doubt. "What if he's right? What if this is the only way?" He stopped in his tracks, turning to face me. His eyes flashed with anger, but beneath that, I could see the fear, the same fear that had been gnawing at me ever since we left the graveyard. "No," he said firmly. "I'm not letting you do this, Samuel. We didn't come this far for you to just give up." "I'm not giving up," I said, though my voice shook. "But what if there's no other option? The dead won't stop. The collectors won't stop." Thomas stared at me for a long moment, his chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. Then, slowly, he shook his head. "We'll find another way," he said, though his voice was quieter now, less certain. "We have to." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that there was another way out of this, that I could break free from the dead without losing myself. But deep down, I knew the truth. The dead had marked me. The collectors were coming for me. and if I didn't do something soon, they would take me back whether I wanted to go. We started walking again, the streets growing darker as the night deepened. The city was far behind now, and the outskirts where we walked were eerily quiet. There were no cars, no people, just the faint sound of the wind and the distant hum of the world that still moved on without us. "We need to find somewhere safe," Thomas said after a while. "At least for tonight. We'll figure out what to do in the morning." I nodded, though I wasn't sure if anywhere was safe anymore. The dead could reach me anywhere, far from the graveyard. They were always with me, always watching, waiting for the moment I would slip back into their world. We walked for hours, the tension between us growing with every step. Neither knew where we were going, but it didn't matter. We just needed to keep moving. Staying still felt like surrender, and neither of us was ready. Finally, we came across an old abandoned warehouse at the edge of the industrial district. Its windows were shattered, and the walls were covered in graffiti, but it looked solid enough. More importantly, it was empty. "This'll do for the night," Thomas said, pushing open the rusted door. We stepped inside, the air cold and musty. The large, open space was filled with broken machinery and rusted metal, but it was quiet. No shadows were lurking here, no whispers of the dead. For the first time in days, I felt a small relief. Thomas found a corner for us to settle in, and we sat down, leaning against the cold concrete wall. The silence between us was heavy, and I could feel the weight of the decision hanging over both of us, whether or not we would go back to the dead and pay the price they demanded. "I don't know what to do," I admitted after a long, quiet stretch. My voice sounded small, hollow, in the vast space of the warehouse. Thomas was quiet for a moment, his gaze fixed on the floor. Then, slowly, he turned to me, his expression hard but determined. "We fight," I blinked, surprised by the intensity in his voice. "Fight?" He nodded, his eyes burning with a fierce determination. "We can't just give in, Samuel. We've come too far for that. If the dead want you back, they'll have to take you by force, and if the collectors come for us, we'll make sure they regret it." His words sent a shiver down my spine, not because I doubted his resolve, but because I knew what he was suggesting was dangerous, suicidal even. The dead were too strong, the collectors too powerful. We didn't stand a chance against them. "We can't fight them," I said, my voice shaking. "They're too strong." "We can try," Thomas said, his voice steady. "We have to try. You're not going back, Samuel. Not like this." His words hung between us, a challenge I wasn't sure I could meet. But as I looked at him, at the fire in his eyes, I realized something. He wasn't just fighting for me. He was fighting for himself, too. He had been running from the same forces I had, hiding from the dead just like I was. And now he was done running. Maybe I was, too. I nodded slowly, the weight of the decision settling over me. "Okay," I said quietly. "We fight." The rest of the night passed in a blur of restless sleep and nervous anticipation. I drifted in and out of consciousness, haunted by dreams of the graveyard, of the dead reaching for me with cold, pale hands. Whenever I closed my eyes, I heard their whispers and pleas for me to return. But when morning finally came, the sun breaking through the warehouse's cracked windows, I felt a strange sense of resolve. I was scared, terrified even, but I wasn't running anymore. Thomas was already awake, standing at the edge of the warehouse, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He turned when he heard me stir, his expression grim but focused. "We need to prepare," he said. "Prepare for what?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "They'll come for us," Thomas said. "We don't know when, but it'll be soon. The dead, the collectors, they know where we are now. We have to be ready." "How do we fight them?" I asked, my heart pounding with a mixture of fear and adrenaline. "How do we stop them?" Thomas held up the book given to us by the man at the sanctuary. "This is a start," he said. "There are rituals in here, spells that can protect us. We just have to figure out how to use them." I nodded, though my hands shook as I took the book from him. The pages were old, the ink faded, but the symbols were clear. They spoke of protection, of binding the dead, of severing the connection between worlds. But they also spoke of sacrifice, of the price that had to be paid to use such power. "We'll need to be careful," I said, flipping through the pages. "These rituals, they're dangerous." Thomas's expression hardened. "We don't have a choice." The day passed in a blur of preparations. We studied the book, practiced the rituals, and made sure we understood what we were up against. But no matter how much we prepared, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wouldn't be enough. By the time we finished, the sun was setting. The shadows lengthened, creeping into the warehouse like a warning. The air grew colder, and the familiar weight of the dead settled over me once more. "They're coming," I whispered, my voice tight with fear. Thomas nodded, his eyes scanning the darkening sky. "We're ready." But were we? I wasn't sure. My hands trembled as I held the book, the words blurring before my eyes. The dead were coming for me. The collectors were coming for us both. And no matter how much we had prepared, I wasn't sure if we stood a chance. The wind outside howled, rattling the broken windows of the warehouse. The shadows deepened, the darkness pressing in from all sides. And then, just as the sun's last light disappeared behind the horizon, the whispers began. "Samuel." My heart leaped into my throat, my breath catching as the voices echoed through the empty warehouse. The dead were here. They had found us. "Samuel, come back!" Thomas was beside me, his hand gripping my arm, his eyes wide with fear. "We have to start the ritual," he said, his voice urgent. I nodded, though my hands shook as I opened the book. The words were a blur of symbols and instructions, but I forced myself to focus. We had practiced this. We knew what we had to do. But as I began to chant, the air around us shifted. The cold deepened, and the whispers grew louder, more frantic. The dead were close now, their presence pressing in on me from all sides. And then, out of the shadows, I saw them. The dead. They moved slowly, their pale, translucent forms barely visible in the darkness. Their faces were hollow and empty, and their eyes glowed faintly with an unnatural light. They reached for me with cold, skeletal hands, their whispers growing louder with every step. "Samuel, come back!" I stumbled back, my heart racing. The ritual, was it working? I couldn't tell. The dead were here, and they were getting closer. "Keep going," Thomas shouted, his voice cutting through the noise. I forced myself to continue, my voice trembling as I chanted the words from the book. The symbols seemed to blur and twist before my eyes, but I couldn't stop. Not now. The dead were almost upon us. I could feel their cold breath on my skin and hear the low hiss of their whispers as they reached for me. And then, from the darkness, came another sound. A low, deep growl. The collector. My blood turned to ice as I saw it, its shadowy form towering over the dead, its glowing eyes locked on me. It moved with a slow, deliberate grace, filling the air with a suffocating weight. "Samuel," it whispered, its voice a deep rumble that sent a shiver down my spine. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. The collector was here. The dead were here. They were all here, and they were coming for me. "Finish the ritual," Thomas shouted, his voice desperate. I tried. I tried to focus, to keep chanting the words, but my voice faltered. The book slipped from my hands, falling to the ground with a soft thud. The collector was so close now, its dark form looming over me, its cold eyes burning with hunger. And then, everything went dark. The darkness swallowed me whole, its cold, suffocating grip pulled me into the abyss. For a moment, there was nothing, no sound, no light, no sensation, just an overwhelming emptiness. It felt like the world had slipped away, and I was alone, drifting in the void. But then, slowly, I became aware of the whispers. They were soft at first, but growing louder and more insistent. "Samuel, come back! You belong with us!" I gasped, my chest heaving as I struggled to breathe. The darkness pressed down on me, squeezing the air from my lungs, but the terrible, familiar voices cut through the blackness like a blade. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel them, the dead, surrounding me, reaching for me, pulling me back toward them. "No," I whispered, my voice trembling. "No, I won't go back." But the whispers grew louder, swirling around me in a dizzying storm of sound and shadow. They were pulling me under, dragging me back to the graveyard, to the world of the dead. I could feel their cold hands wrapping around me, their icy breath on my skin. "Samuel?" Suddenly, there was a flash of light, faint but enough to pierce through the darkness. I blinked, my eyes straining to focus, and I saw a figure. Thomas. He was standing just a few feet away, his face pale and strained, his hand outstretched toward me. He was shouting something, his voice urgent, but the whispers drowned out his words. I tried to reach for him, but my body felt heavy and sluggish, like I was sinking into the ground. The light from the book, the one Thomas had held, was flickering, casting strange shadows across the walls. We had been performing the ritual, trying to bind the dead and keep them from taking me, but it wasn't working, not fast enough. The collector was still there, a dark, looming presence in the distance, its glowing eyes fixed on me. It moved slowly, deliberately, the fog swirling around it like a shroud. And the dead, they were everywhere, their forms shifting in the darkness, their whispers relentless. I had to do something. I couldn't let them take me, not like this. With a burst of strength, I reached for the book, my fingers closing around its worn leather cover. The symbols on the pages glowed faintly, and the words blurred before my eyes, but I forced myself to focus. "Thomas," I shouted, my voice hoarse. "Help me." He moved quickly, dropping beside me as I flipped through the pages. The ritual wasn't finished. Something was missing, something we hadn't done yet. My hands shook as I searched for the next part of the incantation, the words slipping through my mind like water. "We have to finish it," I gasped, my breath coming in short, ragged bursts. "It's the only way." Thomas nodded, his face grim. "Keep going. I'll hold them off." I didn't know how he planned to do that, but I didn't have time to ask. The dead were closing in, their whispers deafening now, their hands reaching for me, pulling me back into the darkness. I could feel the cold seeping into my bones, the weight of their presence pressing down on me. But I kept reading, my voice trembling as I chanted the words from the book. The symbols seemed to pulse with light, the air around us growing thick with energy. The dead hissed, their forms flickering in the darkness, but they didn't stop. They kept coming. "Samuel, you belong with us." My vision blurred, my head pounding to hold the words together. But I couldn't stop. Not now. Thomas stood beside me, his back to the dead, his fists clenched as he faced the collector. The creature was closer now, its tall, twisted form casting a long shadow over the room. I could feel its presence, heavy and oppressive, like a storm building just out of sight. "Keep going," Thomas shouted, his voice sharp with urgency. I forced myself to focus, my eyes locked on the book's pages. The words were challenging, twisting in my mouth as I tried to say them, but I kept pushing forward. I could feel the power building around us, the air growing colder and thicker with every word I spoke. And then, the ground beneath us began to shake. I staggered, nearly dropping the book, but I held on, my voice rising as I chanted the final lines of the ritual. The air around us seemed to crackle with energy, the symbols on the page glowing brighter, burning with an intense light. The dead screamed. It was a sound I had never heard, raw, piercing, full of pain and fear. Their forms flickered, dissolving into mist as the power of the ritual took hold. The whispers that had haunted me for so long fell silent, their voices fading into the darkness. For a brief moment, I thought we had done it. I thought we had won. But then, the collector roared. The sound was deafening, shaking the warehouse walls and rattling the air around us. The light from the book flickered, dimming as the collector's presence grew stronger and darker. Its glowing eyes burned with fury, and fear crashed over me. "Samuel," Thomas shouted, his voice frantic. "We need to finish this now." I nodded, shaking my hands as I turned to the book's final page. The symbols were strange and twisting, like nothing I had ever seen. But I didn't have time to question them. I began to chant, my voice trembling to hold the words together. The light from the book flared, the air around us crackling with energy. The collector let out another roar, but it was different this time, less powerful and more desperate. I could feel its strength waning, the power of the ritual pushing it back. But it wasn't enough. The collector surged forward, its form shifting and growing larger as it moved toward us. The air around it grew colder and darker, and I could feel the dead pressing in from all sides. Their whispers were faint, but still there, still pulling at me. "Samuel, you can't escape." I stumbled, my heart racing as the collector reached for me. Its long, twisted fingers wrapped around my arm, cold as death. I gasped, the pain shooting through me like ice. "Finish it," Thomas shouted, his voice filled with fear. I forced myself to keep chanting, my voice rising over the roar of the collector, over the whispers of the dead. The book glowed brighter, the symbols burning with an intense light, and I could feel the power building around us, pressing against the collector, pushing it back. And then, with a final desperate cry, I spoke the last word of the ritual. The light exploded outward, blinding and fierce, filling the warehouse with a brilliant glow. The collector screamed, its form dissolving into shadow, its grip on me loosening. The dead wailed, their voices rising in a terrible chorus as they were pulled back into the darkness, their whispers finally silenced. I collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath, the book falling from my hands. The air around me was still, the warehouse eerily quiet. The dead were gone. The collector was gone. We had done it. Thomas dropped beside me, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. He looked at me, his face pale and drawn, but there was relief in his eyes. "We did it," he said, his voice shaking with disbelief. "We did it." I nodded, though I could barely speak. My body ached, and my mind felt like it had been stretched to the breaking point, but we were alive. Somehow, we had survived. For a long time, we just sat there, the silence of the warehouse pressing in on us. The dead were gone, but the weight of what we had done still lingered in the air. I didn't know what the future held, but I felt a glimmer of hope for the first time in a long time. The dead had marked me, but they no longer controlled me. The collectors had come for me, but they hadn't taken me. We had won. But deep down, I knew this wasn't the end. The dead never truly let go.